On a warm summer night in the Cleveland suburbs, Jessica awoke with a strange sense of unease. The room was dark, with only faint rays from a street lamp filtering through the curtains. She turned to check the time. It was just after 2 in the morning, and everything should have been quiet. But something inside her told her that something wasn't right. Jessica got out of bed and walked to the window. When she pulled back the curtain, her heart skipped a beat. In the far corner of the yard, where the street lamp usually shone brightly, something was clearly amiss. At first, she couldn't quite make out what it was, but soon noticed the light had dimmed, as if something was covering it. Looking closer, Jessica saw a figure in the shadows carefully wrapping the lamp with bright red cloth. Her breathing quickened. What does this mean? Who is that? Raced through her mind. It didn't look like a harmless prank, it felt ominous. For a moment, she stood there, unsure of what to do. Then, unable to hold back, she ran to her father's bedroom. Dad, wake up. She shook him, breaking the stillness of the night. He woke instantly, sensing the urgency in his daughter's voice. What's going on, Jess? He asked, groggily sitting up in bed. There's someone in the yard. They're doing something to the street lamp, red fabric. I saw them. Without hesitation, her father jumped out of bed. Worry was clear in his eyes, though he tried to stay calm for Jessica. Stay here. I'll check it out, he said, grabbing a flashlight and heading for the door. Jessica stayed behind, her heart pounding. She returned to the window, unable to tear her eyes away from the eerie glow outside. In the darkness, it was hard to see much, but she knew someone was out there, hiding in the shadows, watching them. Jessica's father cautiously opened the back door and stepped into the yard. The night was silent, with only the faint rustling of the wind through the leaves. He held a flashlight, lighting the path ahead, while a growing sense of unease settled in his chest. Jessica rarely got this scared, and something in her voice tonight had put him on high alert. Walking along the fence, he approached the street lamp that now cast only a faint glow, covered by some sort of fabric. He raised the flashlight higher to get a better look. And there it was, a sheet. An ordinary, old, worn sheet, but bright red. It had been carefully draped over the light, as if someone deliberately tried to dim its brightness. He frowned, looking around. No signs of anyone. Everything was as quiet as a suburban night should be. No footprints, no indication that anyone had been there recently. He pulled at the edge of the sheet and, after removing it, scanned the empty yard. No danger, he muttered to himself, trying to quell the rising anxiety. Gathering the fabric into a bundle, he headed back to the house. As he climbed the porch steps, his mind still raced with questions. Who did this? Why the red cloth? And why cover the light? But he didn't want to fuel the panic, neither for himself nor for Jessica. When he returned inside, Jessica was waiting for him in the living room, her worried eyes fixed on him. Well, what was it? She asked, unable to hide her anxiety. He exhaled, chuckling lightly as he handed her the sheet. Here, look, it's just an old sheet. Probably some local kids playing a prank, that's all. See? Nothing to worry about. His voice was calm, with a hint of humor, as though he was trying to ease the tension. Jessica frowned, taking the sheet in her hands. She wasn't convinced it was just a prank. Are you sure it's just a joke? Her voice trembled with unease. Her father placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Yes, I'm sure. There's nothing dangerous here. Tomorrow, we'll talk to the neighbors, maybe someone saw something. But trust me, it's nothing to worry about. Jessica nodded, but her unease lingered. Her father smiled and headed back to his room, while she remained in the living room, gripping the red sheet tightly in her hands. It had only been a few hours since the strange incident with the red sheet. But Jessica couldn't fall asleep. She tossed and turned, replaying her father's words over and over in her mind. It's just a prank by some teenagers. Yet something inside her told her that it was far more serious. The quiet night, which had always been comforting, now only heightened her anxiety. Suddenly, amidst the muffled street sounds, Jessica picked up on something new, the sound of an engine. A car had stopped somewhere nearby. Her heart began to race. Rising from her bed, she moved silently toward the window. Gently pulling the curtain aside, Jessica saw an old gray car parked by the side of the road. In the dim streetlight, she noticed the driver hadn't gotten out. The headlights were off, but the engine was still running, as if the person inside was waiting for something. Holding her breath, She turned her gaze toward the yard. Her heart froze in terror. In the shadows, near the bushes at the far end of the garden, stood a figure. A dark silhouette of a person, hidden among the plants, clearly watching her house. Jessica stepped back, her heart pounding in panic. She barely dared to peek out the window again, but what she saw wouldn't leave her mind. The figure was still there, barely moving, as if waiting. In the moonlight, its outline seemed even more sinister. "Oh, God," she whispered, feeling a wave of fear rising within her. Jessica rushed to grab the phone, her trembling fingers dialing 911. Her voice was shaky, but she tried to speak clearly. "Hello, police? I think someone's watching my house." She struggled to keep her voice steady, glancing nervously at the window. "Please, send someone. I don't know what's going on." The operator calmly reassured her that a patrol car was already on its way to their house, but it didn't ease her fear. Jessica returned to the window, but now the figure was gone. The bushes swayed gently in the wind, as if someone had just moved through them. She stood there, staring out at the empty yard, feeling utterly helpless. The car on the road remained parked, its engine still humming quietly, but there was no movement inside or outside. One thought circled in Jessica's mind: someone had been there. Someone was watching her. Jessica, still trembling, curled up on the chair by the window, her ears attuned to the quiet hum of the car engine outside. A few minutes later, she heard a familiar sound, the sirens of police cars cutting through the night. She exhaled a bit, feeling some relief knowing that help was on the way. But her heart continued to race, refusing to calm down. When two police cars pulled up in front of her house, their headlights illuminated the street, and she glanced out the window again. The gray car that had been there moments ago was now gone. Only an empty road stretched before her eyes. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, their silhouettes clearly visible under the streetlights. Jessica rushed down the stairs and flung open the front door, meeting the officers on the porch. "Good evening, ma'am," one of the officers, a man in his 40s with dark hair and a serious expression, spoke first. "We received your call. What happened?" She quickly tried to explain. "A few minutes ago, there was a car parked here, and someone was hiding in the bushes behind my house. I saw them. They were there, and..." She paused, trying to steady her trembling voice. "Now the car is gone. They've left, but I'm sure someone was watching us." The officers exchanged glances, and then the younger one, with a short haircut and a brisk step, went to check the backyard, while his partner continued speaking with Jessica. "We'll take a look, but if the car has left, it might not be nearby anymore," said the older officer, his tone calm and professional. "Did you notice any details? The license plate, make, or model of the car?" Jessica shook her head, frustration building inside her. "No, it was an old gray car, but I didn't get a chance to see the plates. It all happened so fast." The officers checked the backyard, the bushes, and even scanned the area around the house, but found no sign of the suspicious person. After about 20 minutes of searching, they returned to Jessica with disappointing news. "Ma'am, there's nothing suspicious here," the younger officer said, leaning slightly toward her to emphasize his words. "We searched the yard and the surrounding area, but there's no sign of the car or anyone." Jessica couldn't believe it. Her anxiety turned into despair. "But I saw him. I saw him hiding by the bushes. And I heard the car. It was parked right there." She pointed to the spot by the road where she had seen the vehicle earlier. The older officer nodded kindly. "We believe you, miss. But right now, there are no signs of anything. If you notice anything again, call us immediately. We'll increase patrols in the area just in case." After exchanging a few more words, the officers left, leaving Jessica standing on the porch in the quiet night. She felt vulnerable and drained. The anxiety that had taken root inside her didn't fade. It only grew stronger. Returning to her bedroom, Jessica tried to lie back down, but every sound seemed suspicious, every rustle amplified her fears. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching the house, even if the police had found nothing. Sleep was impossible. The next morning, tired and still feeling uneasy, Jessica stepped outside. The sunlight felt too bright after such a dark and tense night, and despite the warmth of the day, she felt a chill in her heart. As she headed toward the mailbox, she noticed her neighbor, Mrs. Garrett, standing by the fence. "Good morning, Jessica," the elderly woman greeted her with a concerned expression. How are you? You look tired. Jessica tried to smile, but it didn't come off well. Yeah, it was a restless night. I had to call the police. Mrs. Garrett frowned. The police? Oh dear, what happened? Jessica briefly recounted the events of the night, the strange lights, the figure hiding behind the bushes, and the car that vanished when the officers arrived. She expected Mrs. Garrett to say something like, "You must have imagined it," but the reaction was quite different. You're not the first one to notice something strange, Mrs. Garrett whispered, leaning closer to Jessica as if afraid someone might overhear them. My husband said he saw a man walking down the street a couple of nights ago, stopping by houses. I didn't see it myself, but he said the man was dressed oddly. At first, we thought he was a homeless person, but now we're not so sure. Jessica felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She was about to ask for more details, but their conversation was interrupted by Mr. Carlson, their neighbor from across the street, who was out walking his Labrador. Good morning, he called, waving. Did you hear about the guy walking around our neighborhood last night? Jessica and Mrs. Garrett exchanged worried glances. What are you talking about, Mr. Carlson? Mrs. Garrett asked. The man approached, holding his dog's leash, and nodded. I got home late from work, and when I parked, I saw a guy standing by one of the houses on the street. He was wearing gray, seemed to be looking at the windows or doors. I didn't think much of it at first, but now I realize it's odd. Who walks around at night staring at houses? Jessica felt her heart start pounding again. All these stories from her neighbors were fueling her fear. Did you see his car? She asked, her voice trembling. No, I didn't, Mr. Carlson replied. But I can tell you. That guy wasn't from around here. I'd have remembered him. The conversations with her neighbors only heightened Jessica's anxiety. She was now certain that what had happened the night before wasn't just a coincidence or a prank by local teens. Something strange was happening in their quiet neighborhood, and someone was definitely watching their homes. When she returned home, the unsettling thoughts wouldn't leave her. She knew this wasn't just an isolated incident, and the whole situation was becoming more and more frightening. Jessica sat on the edge of her bed, hugging herself, still shaken by her neighbors' stories. Her house, which once felt like the safest place in the world, now filled her with anxiety. She couldn't just sit and wait for something to happen. Her determination grew stronger with each passing hour. When her father came home from work that evening, Jessica approached him immediately. Dad, she began, trying to speak as calmly as possible, though her voice betrayed her tension. We need to do something. I can't sleep knowing someone might be watching us. Her father, already aware of where the conversation was heading, sighed heavily. He didn't want to admit that things could be serious, but he could see how much it was worrying his daughter. What do you suggest? He asked, crossing his arms. Cameras, Jessica replied confidently. And new locks. I won't feel safe here until I know we're at least somewhat protected. Her father frowned, wincing at the idea, which he thought was excessive. Jessica, I understand that you're upset, but I think this was just a misunderstanding. Those teenagers could have, he started, but Jessica cut him off. No, Dad, it's not teenagers. I talked to the neighbors. They saw someone too. What if he's planning something? We can't take that risk. I won't be able to sleep until I know we have some security. He paused, looking at his daughter, her eyes filled with worry. He didn't want to give in to panic, but he knew how important this was to her. All right, he finally nodded. We'll install the cameras. For your peace of mind. But, Jessica, I don't think this is going to catch some kid playing a prank. Thank you, Dad, she whispered, relieved, hugging him. The next day, they called a specialist who quickly installed cameras around the perimeter of the house. Every corner of the yard was now under surveillance, the front door, the backyard, and along the fence. Jessica felt a bit of the tension inside her release. At least now they would be able to see what was happening around the house at night. At the same time, they replaced all the locks on the doors. Her father even installed new latches on the windows so that nothing was left unchecked. He still treated these measures with skepticism, thinking they were an overreaction, but he understood how important it was for his daughter. When the work was done, Jessica sat in front of the monitor, watching the camera feeds. Nothing suspicious was happening, but she finally felt a little more secure. It didn't solve all the problems. But at least it was a start. Several days had passed since Jessica and her father had installed the cameras around the house. At first, everything seemed calm, and Jessica even started to relax a bit. But one night, close to midnight, her phone let out a short notification sound. It was an alert from the security cameras. Jessica sat up abruptly, her heart racing. She grabbed her phone and opened the camera app. The screen showed footage from one of the cameras in the yard. In the shadows between the trees, something flickered, a movement, barely noticeable, but enough to trigger the camera. She zoomed in, peering into the darkness. Was it a person? Or an animal? Her fingers trembled as she tried to pause the video at the clearest point of the motion. The camera had captured only a blurry figure, slipping by in the dark. No face was visible, but the movement seemed too deliberate for a random passerby. He's back, Jessica thought. She grabbed her laptop and started reviewing the footage carefully. The figure in the shadows moved cautiously, but for one brief moment, it stopped near the fence, as if watching the house. Jessica felt a cold chill in her chest. This wasn't an accident. Her anxiety grew. She watched the recording over and over, this time switching between different cameras to gather more information. But none of them gave a clear image of who it was. The person's face remained indistinguishable, only adding to her fear. Now, she couldn't take her eyes off the screen. Even when the footage showed nothing suspicious anymore, Jessica kept rewatching it, trying to catch the smallest detail. Time passed, and she continued analyzing every movement, every faint noise captured by the cameras. Everything could be important. A few hours later, Jessica was still glued to the screen. Her eyes were tired, but she didn't turn off the monitor. A thought crossed her mind: what if this is the same person the neighbors saw? Now, she was certain this wasn't just a prank. Someone was watching her house. Someone knew they had installed cameras and was still trying to go unnoticed. Her paranoia intensified. Every night, she checked the cameras. Even the faintest noise outside would jolt her awake, and she would feverishly scan the screens, searching for something. She was terrified that soon she would hear the sound of a car stopping or see the shadow of a figure near the bushes again. Now, Jessica didn't feel safe, even with the cameras. Every alert from them was a reminder that the danger could be closer than she had ever imagined. The next day, while Jessica was still recovering from her restless night, the neighborhood was shaken by new, unsettling news. Allison, their neighbor 2 houses down, had disappeared. Allison lived alone and often went out for morning walks, always greeting her neighbors with a friendly smile. But today, her house was eerily quiet. By evening, word of Allison's disappearance had spread throughout the neighborhood. Her car had been found parked at a local shopping center, but she was nowhere to be found. The discovery of her abandoned car without any trace of her left the community in a state of unease. Jessica stood by the window, listening as her parents discussed the situation with other residents. Everyone was in shock. No one could grasp how something like this could happen in their quiet suburban neighborhood. Meanwhile, Jessica's mind raced. Could this be connected to what I saw? Or is it just a coincidence? The fear she felt toward the mysterious figure only grew stronger. Could the same threat have now fallen upon Allison? Jessica once again reviewed the camera footage, scanning it with heightened anxiety. She began to wonder if the disappearance was the work of someone who had been watching the neighborhood for some time. The news had already reported on Allison's disappearance, and the police had begun their search. But a sense of uncertainty loomed over the community. No one knew how to react, and everyone felt a creeping sense of danger. For Jessica, this was the moment when her worry turned into full-blown paranoia. Days passed since Allison's disappearance, and the tension in Jessica's house grew. She couldn't shake the anxious thoughts that something sinister was happening in their neighborhood. Against this backdrop, Jessica began to notice odd behavior from her older brother, Mark. In recent weeks, Mark had often been absent at night. He always had some excuse: he was hanging out with friends or just wanted to get some fresh air. But after everything that had happened, Jessica started to doubt his words. One night, unable to sleep, she accidentally saw Mark quietly leave the house, glancing around as if he didn't want to be seen. Her heart raced. He had never been truthful about where he went. What if her brother was somehow involved in all of this? These thoughts plagued her. The next morning, during breakfast, Jessica tried to share her suspicions with their father. "Dad, I need to talk to you about Mark. I'm not sure, but he's been acting strangely lately. He often leaves at night, and last night, I saw him leave at 2 in the morning without telling anyone." She said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. Her father looked up from the newspaper and frowned. Mark is an adult, Jess. He's just hanging out with friends or going for a walk to unwind. Don't work yourself up, especially now with everything so unsettling. This has nothing to do with anything dangerous. He waved her off, as if he didn't want to think about her concerns. But Jessica wasn't convinced. She knew her brother, and his late-night absences were starting to seem suspicious. Her father might ignore it, but her intuition told her that Mark was hiding something, and now she was determined to find out what it was. Jessica's anxiety grew with each passing day, and it became increasingly difficult for her to ignore Mark's behavior. Her brother's late-night outings had become too frequent, and she decided she had to take action. Since their father wouldn't listen to her suspicions, Jessica resolved to keep an eye on Mark herself to gather evidence. One night, when everyone in the house was asleep, Jessica sat in her room and waited. She heard the familiar sound of the front door opening and closing. Cautiously peering out the window, she saw Mark stealthily making his way toward the road. Her heart raced. Grabbing her phone, she quietly followed him, hoping not to be noticed. As she approached the living room window, she saw Mark walk up to an unfamiliar car parked at the end of their street. A dim light illuminated the inside of the vehicle, and someone was sitting inside. Mark knocked briefly on the window, and the door opened. He got into the front seat. Jessica caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the driver's seat, but the face was hidden in darkness. Her breath quickened. "Who is that?" flashed through her mind. She quickly snapped a few photos on her phone, capturing the car and her brother's silhouette inside. This was her chance to show their father that his nonchalance had been a mistake. The car started and quietly drove down the street, disappearing into the night. Jessica stood at the window, unable to look away from the darkness. Her brother was clearly hiding something, and now she knew it for sure. The next day, Jessica wasted no time and headed to the police station with the surveillance footage and the photos she had taken the night before. The police were already becoming concerned after Allison's disappearance, and her suspicions about Mark's behavior caught their attention. Officer Brown, who was handling the case, carefully reviewed the materials provided. The camera footage showed blurry silhouettes, but it was enough to confirm that something had been happening on Jessica's street on those nights. The photos of her brother getting into an unknown car only heightened the suspicions. "We'll look into all of this," Officer Brown said, returning Jessica's phone. "I think you should talk to Mark directly. Maybe he just doesn't realize how dangerous the situation is." "I tried," Jessica sighed. "Dad doesn't believe anything is wrong either." The officers acted quickly. The next day, they called Mark in for questioning. Jessica waited at home with growing anxiety, imagining how everything would unfold. Her brother returned a couple of hours later and went straight to his room without saying a word. She approached the door and knocked, feeling guilty but knowing she had taken the right step. "Mark," she began quietly, "did they say anything?" The door opened, and her brother looked irritated. "Nothing," he replied coldly. "I told them what they wanted to hear. You're just complicating things, Jess. You need to calm down. Especially after everything that happened with Allison. They already told you, it's just a coincidence." Jessica knew her brother was trying to hide something more. His calm demeanor and ease in speaking with the police only deepened her doubts. Soon she realized that the police didn't have enough evidence yet, and if they didn't uncover the truth now, Mark could cover his tracks. The next day, the police returned to Jessica's house. Officer Brown and his colleague, Detective Harper, decided to conduct a more thorough search of the area around the home. Jessica watched from the window as they examined the backyard and the surrounding bushes. Her father remained skeptical, but seeing how upset his daughter was, he allowed the officers to carry out an additional inspection. At one point, Detective Harper stopped at the back porch and squinted suspiciously. "Look at this," he said, leaning down to the ground. Officer Brown approached and saw what the detective was pointing at. There was a shoe print on the ground, strange and deep, as if its owner had stood in one spot for a long time. It seemed like someone was trying to disguise their presence. "These are definitely not from house slippers," Brown said thoughtfully, inspecting the prints from different angles. "Look at the depth of these impressions. Someone clearly came here late at night." The officers took photographs, measured the prints, and noted the direction of the tracks, which led to the gate in the backyard. These prints became particularly significant when they compared them to evidence from another case, Allison's disappearance. When they returned to the station, forensic specialists compared the shoe prints found at Jessica's house with those discovered near Allison's home. The results were unexpected. The prints matched. The person who left these footprints at Jessica's house had also been near Allison's house on the night she disappeared. "This can't be just a coincidence," Officer Brown said, studying the reports. "It seems we've found a serious lead. Now we need to figure out how this connects to Mark and the nighttime events." Hearing the news, Jessica felt a mix of relief and rising anxiety. The shoe prints found at her home only confirmed her fears. Someone had been watching them, and it could be much more serious than she had thought. Jessica sat in her room, as usual, reviewing the surveillance footage on her laptop. She was worried not only about the events of the past few days but also about what might come next. The discovery of the shoe prints had struck a serious blow to her sense of safety, and she found herself increasingly questioning what else lay hidden behind the facade of her calm life. When her phone suddenly vibrated, she noticed a notification, a new anonymous message. Her heart raced as she opened it. The message was brief and contained only a few words, but they made her blood run cold. "Your brother is involved in something bigger than you can imagine. Be careful." Her hands trembled, and she read the message again, unable to believe what she saw. The paranoia she had already been grappling with took on a new, terrifying shade. Jessica realized that if someone knew about her brother and her suspicions, it could mean that he was indeed connected to the situation. Dark thoughts began to swirl in her mind, and fear filled her consciousness. In a panic, Jessica ran out of her room and headed to the living room, where her parents were watching TV. She gripped her phone tightly and tried to explain the situation calmly. "Mom, Dad, I just received an anonymous message," she started, her voice trembling. "It says that Mark is involved in something serious. I can't understand what it means, but I'm afraid for our safety." Jessica's father, Peter, raised an eyebrow and tried to take control of the situation. "Jess, you can't take such messages seriously without evidence. It could just be someone playing a prank," he said, trying to remain calm. But Jessica couldn't settle down. She didn't want to take any risks and thought they should temporarily leave the house. She continued to insist to her parents, "Please, listen to me. If this is true, we need to get away for a while. It can't be a coincidence that this message came right now." Her mother, Lisa, saw how deeply distressed Jessica was and eventually agreed. "Okay," Lisa said, "we'll leave for a few days to a hotel. But, Jess, we also need to give the police more time to investigate. They might uncover this faster if we cooperate." Though anxious, Jessica felt a sense of relief that her parents agreed to take steps to ensure their safety. They began packing for a short-term move, and Jessica tried to remain calm, understanding that staying in a hotel might help avoid further dangers. As they packed, Jessica checked her messages again and noticed that, in addition to the anonymous one, her phone had started receiving strange calls from unknown numbers. She felt the situation becoming increasingly complicated and dangerous. The night was quiet, and it seemed all of Jessica's worries were behind her as she drifted off to sleep in the hotel room. But suddenly, her peace was shattered by a loud alert on her phone. Someone was trying to break into their house. Jessica bolted upright in bed, her heart racing. Fear surged within her, and she quickly turned on her phone to call the police. Trembling with fear, she dialed emergency services, her hands shaking. She whispered into the phone, "Please, help, someone is trying to break into our house. We're at the hotel. Yes, our house is empty, but this could be serious." The police assured her that they were sending a unit to the location. But each second felt like an eternity. Jessica understood that something serious was happening. Without wasting any time, she rushed to her parents' room. The door swung open, and she blurted out, "Someone is trying to break into our house. I just spoke with the police." Her parents, immediately sensing her distress, jumped out of bed. Her father, despite the shock, quickly assessed the situation and commanded, "We're going home. We can't wait." They hurriedly got dressed and left the hotel. The car sped down the dark road, and the tension in the vehicle grew with every passing minute. Jessica sat in the back seat, eyes glued to her phone screen, waiting for new notifications. But all the cameras showed was an empty, dark space. As they approached the house, police officers were already standing at the gate. The blue and red flashing lights reflected off the windows, adding even more drama to the scene. The officers were carefully inspecting the area, shining flashlights into the corners of the yard and against the walls of the house. "Everything's okay, miss," said an officer as they got out of the car. The intruder managed to escape, but it appears the break-in was planned seriously. The locks are damaged, there are signs of forced entry, but no one got inside. Jessica and her family were safe, but the fear and anxiety caused by this incident lingered. They felt once again that their lives had become a target for something far more sinister than they could have imagined. As soon as the police began to inspect the area, they noticed movement in the backyard, where they spotted a suspicious figure trying to hide in the darkness. The officers immediately pursued him and soon managed to apprehend a man who was clearly attempting to flee the crime scene. Jessica was among those watching as the police led the detainee to their car. Her heart raced with excitement and anticipation. Her eyes followed every movement, trying to discern who was behind the nighttime threat. When the suspect was taken to the station for questioning, Jessica and her parents, along with the officers, went there to seek answers. Time dragged on slowly, and Jessica felt tense, waiting for news. Shortly after the questioning began, the police confirmed that the detainee was Mark's friend, Jacob Miller. The interrogation revealed that Jacob was deeply involved in the case of Allison's disappearance. He confessed that he had acted under the direction of an unknown individual who coerced him into committing such crimes. Jessica was shocked by Jacob's words. He explained that he had been recruited and used as a runner for a larger scheme. Jacob stated that he had no choice and was under pressure from his accomplice, who promised him protection and money in exchange for his services. According to Jacob, his instigator was well organized and elusive. This person used Jacob to monitor suspicious areas and commit crimes to distract from their own actions. He also admitted to knowing some details about Allison's abduction and other similar incidents. These confessions became a turning point in the investigation. The police began an active search for the unknown instigator based on Jacob's testimony. Soon after, operations commenced to disrupt the criminal organization, which turned out to have a wide-reaching network. For Jessica and her family, this moment was both a relief and the start of a new chapter in their fight for safety. They understood that, despite Jacob's arrest, the real threat had not yet been completely eliminated. There was still much work to be done to expose and stop the main perpetrators. With a sense of relief but also anxiety, Jessica and her family returned home. Ready for the next phase of the investigation, which they hoped would lead to a final resolution of this terrifying ordeal. The morning began with a somber mood as Jessica, her parents, and the police gathered in their home to discuss the latest findings of the investigation. The officers arrived early to share new data collected after Jacob's interrogation and further inquiries. Detective Harper, leading the investigation, revealed that the case involving Mark had far more serious and complex roots than they initially suspected. The police uncovered that Mark and his friends were entangled with a gang actively involved in drug trafficking. This gang had extensive connections in the criminal underworld and used local teenagers for dirty work, ranging from drug distribution to intimidation and coercion of anyone who might interfere with their operations. It turned out that Mark, under the influence of his friends, had become a part of this scheme as an active participant in their criminal activities. The police discovered that the mysterious figures Jessica had seen near her home were part of an intimidation attempt against her family. The gang employed threats and blackmail to eliminate potential obstacles, placing Jessica and her family at the center of their focus. The covering of streetlights with red fabric and nighttime surveillance were all tactics of intimidation. Officers presented evidence linking Mark to the gang. They found hidden recordings and documents indicating his involvement in drug sales and connections with key figures in the criminal organization. For Jessica, this was a horrifying revelation. Her own brother was part of a criminal world she had never suspected. Upon learning the truth had been revealed, Mark appeared dejected and frightened. He confessed his guilt but also explained how he had fallen under the gang's influence. According to him, they used threats against his family to force him into compliance. His involvement in criminal activities was a result of manipulation and fear. Jessica's parents were shocked and devastated, but they understood that much work lay ahead. They began cooperating with the police, providing all necessary testimony and information to assist in the investigation and expose the gang. Despite the gravity of the situation, Jessica felt that the fight for justice had finally begun. The police actively continued their operation to dismantle the gang, and soon arrests of key members of the organization commenced. Jessica and her family hoped that these steps would help restore peace in their lives and prevent further threats. What started as nighttime fears and mysterious threats had now turned into a serious investigation, leading to the exposure of a significant criminal network. Jessica and her family realized that the true threat ran much deeper than they could have imagined, and their path to recovery was just beginning. Weeks passed after Mark and his accomplices were arrested, and the criminal network was exposed. The neighborhood where Jessica lived began to return to a peaceful existence, but the aftermath of the terrifying ordeal was still palpable. Jessica's home was once again filled with light and warmth, yet shadows of the recent past lingered in every corner. Her parents tried to create a sense of normalcy for both Jessica and themselves. They resumed familiar activities, taking walks, meeting friends, and organizing family dinners. But there was an underlying tension in their actions, no matter how hard they tried to conceal it. Jessica struggled to return to her usual routine, but feelings of anxiety and distrust persisted. She began attending support groups, where she met others who had experienced similar hardships. These gatherings provided her with understanding and empathy that were so crucial during this challenging time. Efforts to restore safety in the neighborhood were in full swing. The police implemented additional security measures, and a program to improve street lighting and increase patrols began in the area. Despite all the attempts to return to normal life, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that their home was under constant surveillance. Every strange noise or unfamiliar passerby became a source of concern for her. She continued to check the security cameras and kept a close eye on the news, determined not to miss anything important. However, Jessica found comfort in knowing that she and her family were safe. They realized that each step toward recovery was a step toward a new, more vigilant life. Jessica understood that she now had to learn to live with this heightened awareness of danger and how to manage the persistent feelings of anxiety. Day by day, Jessica grew more confident in her abilities. Although her life would never be the same as it once was, she began seeking ways to cope with this new reality and adapt to it. She aimed to live fully, refusing to let her fears control her life. Thus, despite the destruction and suffering, Jessica and her family started rebuilding their lives, aware that true threats could hide in the most inconspicuous places, and that their strength and determination would help them move forward despite all they had endured.